Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first of 4 advisor series, where we're going to take a deeper dive into conversations that we hope are beneficial for you in your advising of our fraternities and sororities on campus. We hope that these conversations not only help you grow as an advisor, but just as a person in general. We kind of picked 4 areas that we thought and you have expressed interest in learning more ways to support our students and grow as individuals themselves. These series will be a chance to really allow us to serve you in a way that we haven't been able to do so in the past. So we hope that these are beneficial and are ways that we can really foster this new sense of support for the people who support our chapters on the ground and are really helping to do the work of the fraternal movement. To kind of start us off, our first topic is a transition, living in a COVID environment. And we have 2 great panelists with us today. We're super excited for both of them to join us. So on the panel, we have Dr. Krystal Allen. She uses she, her pronouns and serves as the Associate Director of the Office of Student Conduct and Community Standards here at Temple. Inclusive of her days as a resident advisor at the East Carolina University, Krystal has been in the field of higher education and student affairs for nearly 20 years. Both her master's and PhD focus on higher education leadership. She serves as one of the co-chairs of membership engagement for the NASPA Women in Student Affairs Knowledge Communities and is an active member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She is a member of Go on the Girl Book Club and one of the nation's largest, which is one of the nation's largest book clubs for women of African dysphoria. When not working, Krystal enjoys a few things such as reading and spending time with family and friends. We also have Camile Bloomberg. Camile earned a Master's of Science degree in counseling and a Master's of Arts therapy from Wright State University in Daytona, Ohio. She received a Bachelor's of Arts degree from William Patterson University in Art Education and Psychology. She is also a certified prevention specialist, art therapist, clinical supervisor, and disordered gambling therapist. She has worked as a chief of addiction services for Mercer County, as an adjunct professor and screener for the Intoxicated Drivers Resource Center at the College of New Jersey, and as the director of development for the Corner House Behavioral Health in Princeton. She has significant experience working with individuals and families impacted with anxiety, depression, and relationship issues and substance use disorders. And as I said, we are super excited to have both of you here today. I will kind of go over what the layout of today looks like, and then we'll jump right in. So we'll ask a series of questions, but we also ask that our attendees also use either the chat feature or the Q&A feature to submit questions to myself or Nikia in order to ask them of the panelists. We will be recording this session so that way anyone who was not able to attend, and for your reference later, you'll be able to watch the recording as we continue on with these series. Our first question is, what effects does drug and alcohol have on people who have been or could be diagnosed with COVID?
We know that coronavirus affects the respiratory system dramatically. So getting to your first question, how does it affect, alcohol and drugs affect COVID-19 or students with COVID or potential? Well, alcohol is a depressant. Alcohol affects our respiratory system dramatically. According to the World Health Organization, there is no way the consumption of alcohol will protect you from COVID-19 or being affected from it. That is just a myth. That is not going to happen. Facts about alcohol: alcohol affects both short and long term, has effects for short and the long term. Especially, this is really important, and I think as advisors, you need to say this to your students very clearly. Heavy use of alcohol weakens the immune system and thus reduces the ability to cope with infectious diseases. So we are in a pandemic of an infectious disease. And if you're going to put yourself higher at risk by using heavy alcohol. Secondly, alcohol, when you're under the influence of alcohol, your judgment is impaired, your decision making is impaired, and your behaviors change. So in a perfect world, when we're all thinking clearly and we're all understanding the 6 feet of separation and wearing our masks, when we're under the influence of alcohol, in general, we don't make great decisions. But now it's very imperative that we understand that when we're putting ourselves at a higher risk, because we can't make informed decisions when we're under the use of alcohol. We think we can, but research has proven that our ability to make sound decisions reduces dramatically when we're under the influence. Heavy use of alcohol increases the risk of acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, ARDS. It's one of the most severe complications of COVID. So we know that the two are together. I just want to share you some myths about alcohol. Here's the myth. Consuming alcohol destroys the virus that causes COVID-19. No, it doesn't. Consuming alcohol will not destroy the virus, and consumption is likely to increase your risk. We just said that. The second myth. Drinking strong alcohol kills the virus in the inhaled air. That's not true. Alcohol, it will not disinfect your mouth and throat, and it will not give you any protection against COVID-19. Third myth. Alcohol, beer, wine, distilled spirits, or herbal alcohol stimulates immunity and resistance to the virus. Again, alcohol has a harmful effect on your immune system and will not stimulate immunity to the virus. So what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to tell your students to do? Avoid alcohol altogether so that you don't undermine your own immune system and do not risk the health of others. And if you do drink, because let's be realistic, we know college students will drink. We're not going to be naive to think that no one's going to drink. Keep your drinking to a minimum and avoid getting intoxicated. Keep your wits about you. Social distancing is key. We know that. And we've seen that when students and people are in bars, casinos, even outdoors with masks, the increase in cases in places like Florida, even on the Jersey Shore, we've seen more cases because people are not social distancing and keeping 6 feet apart and wearing masks. When you're speaking with students about responsible alcohol use and social behaviors, it's recommended that you emphasize the following things. If you choose to use alcohol in social situations, make sure you're socializing in a well-ventilated, preferably outdoor setting, but be aware of being respectful of your neighbors, watching your noise volume, cleaning up your trash. You know, one of the worst things that are happening is people are urinating all over their neighbors' yards. Unacceptable. Be extra mindful about drinking in moderation, since excessive alcohol consumption reduces your inhibitions and decreases social distancing. You need, as the temple advisors, you need to know what the temple guidelines and have they made them or not, and when they do, share them with your students about the amount of people that can gather in any one place, and remind students of the amnesty policy. If you see something, say something. Again, I really have to tell you the importance of alcohol weakens the immune system. None of us need to have a reduced immune system in this day, right here in the present. We all need to be aware of what's happening and to keep ourselves as healthy as possible. Any questions you can ask me? Did you get any questions on that stuff?
No questions just yet. I think that's a lot of really great content. And I think some additional information that maybe some of us haven't been thinking about. I think, you know, we've been putting our mask on and and remaining 6 feet apart, but not necessarily thinking about some of the everyday things that could be putting us at greater risk that personally, and certainly with our students, are so used to just being able to consume alcohol, hopefully if they're over 21. And that, that might not be the case, even given some of the guidelines if we're trying to be our healthiest self. Krystal, can I ask what this looks like in the context of us being a community and really putting some of this into practice, or additional things we want to consider as we make our returns to campus? I think Camile gave us some really good insight about what it means to be a good neighbor, and what that looks like in the context of us being condensed in the North Philadelphia community. But we'll love your perspective as a university administrator.
Yeah, and Camile, thank you. I was very fascinated by some of the things that you were talking about. I think for our students and even for faculty and staff, it's going to be a challenge when we return, in the sense of, I even think about me, like I am such a person who's, when I see people that I haven't seen in forever and I'm so excited and I want to completely violate the social distancing, and want to hug and stuff. So I can see that for our community, it's going to have to be, how do we take care of ourselves? It's sort of like, I always use this sort of statement of protecting the nest. But how are we going to be able to do that with each other? And that, how do we practice our social distancing? The university is working really hard to try to come up with measures to make sure that, students that are going to return back to campus, that there is ways that they are safe. And so I think it's going to have to be a twofold, that the university is not just in the measures of making sure that we've got classroom space that allows for the social distancing and wearing your mask. And that's a policy that the university has put forward, that everybody has to wear a mask. And so, I think as an institution, we're trying to put measures in place to make sure that everyone stays safe. But the fact is I can only make you as safe as what you help participate with me in. And so I think it's having some of those, like the conversations of, everyone is important, and we want to bring you back. And there is probably still a lot of trepidation about bringing people back, and is this the best measure in bringing individuals back into the space? But if we're going to be back here, how do we be good stewards of our own health and our being, and how do we also make sure we're doing that for our fellow owls that are not just students, but also your faculty and your staff? And so I think as advisors, is having some of those conversations with students about what is it, how do we help set the standard of what community looks like now? Because I think it's not going to just be on administrators to be like enforcing that, or like really supporting that and uplifting that concept. But I also think it's going to be on a lot of our student leaders and those that are within, our fraternity and sorority world. We see them as leaders, and so we're going to be calling on them to sort of help us propel that notion of, this is a community. We are a community within a community. And so how do we not only protect ourselves and support ourselves in being safe, but how do we also make sure we're doing that for those individuals who live around us? Because those that are in the Northern Philadelphia area, a lot of them are also older. And so that they are more susceptible to something happening to them. COVID has also sort of revealed to us sort of like the disparities of what's happening like within our healthcare system and for those in marginalized populations. And so the reality is Temple sits within a marginalized population. And so a lot of those individuals, if we are not careful and if we are not being good neighbors, as Camile was sort of highlighting, if we're not being good neighbors, it's not only, detrimental to us as the Temple community, but it's also detrimental to our North Philadelphia community members. And so we're going to need to be having conversations with our fraternity and sorority leaders, as well as other student leaders, about how we make sure we encourage this notion of we have got to protect the nest, as well as protecting our nest that surrounds us as well.
And just to add to something that Krystal was saying, and in September, mid-October, outside is a great viable option, right? But as the weather changes and it starts to get colder, and where do we have people gather? How do we have them gather in bigger spaces? Colleagues of mine at the College of New Jersey have done a paper that said it's one basement party away from an increase in the pandemic in your community. So, yes, we can start to think of this in September, early October, mid-October, but as the weather starts to change, what happens then? Where do we have bigger spaces for students to congregate? Do we have like the ballroom where they could have a smaller gathering, but in a larger space? That kind of thing as we go through the school year. And of course, I'm talking October, November, but then you're talking February, March, when it's cold. What are we going to do then? So I just think it's a bigger picture to think of the things I'm saying, the things you're saying, to not just for September, but then further on into the year, how this may change as you as advisors and your leaders in the sororities and fraternities have to look at students and say, how are we going to think outside of the box? What are we going to do differently?
Yeah. And I agree. I also think it's going to be us as administrators having to make sure that we're thinking like a student, and remembering what it was to be a student, and in that traditional age of that 18 to 22, 23. And, not that all students are that when they're entering into the space, but traditionally that these are the students that we're serving, and for us to remember where we were and how we were thinking in that space. And that sometimes we were thinking that we are invincible, and that, it's not going to happen to me. And so I think for us as administrators and as advisors, we're going to have to be thinking 2 and 3 steps ahead of them. And so we know it's going to get cold. We know that they like to then go internal, and where they will party and gather. And so is it going to really be for us to have to think about how can we create spaces, if we have the space, to where they can have an option to gather and be socially distanced and safe. And so not in the sense of that we're trying to promote their parties or their socials or their gatherings, but that we also are trying to promote their safety. And so trying to think ahead of them, to give them those measures so that they don't put themselves in a position to cause harm to themselves and others.
Yeah, I think too, on a different kind of note, but similar, we had some experience with making some of this transition when we had the mumps. And that was a very big conversation within fraternity and sorority life. And the students didn't do it, right? So like, how do we relate some of this conversation back to that experience, right? Of COVID is much worse than the mumps itself. But we saw that in practice, that wasn't a way that we, were being distant. We were still participating in social events and taking part. So I know we will be having conversations with chapter leadership at our leadership retreat in August. We actually have Mark Denny's from Student Health coming to have more of a conversation on the health lens of things. But definitely some of the conversation that you both have been having is key to what our advisors can help to continue to support our students with, but definitely, relating it back to this experience that we had not that long ago that we saw when it wasn't done right and what the effects were. So how do we, kind of pivot from here? I think my real next question is like, what advice do you have for student organizations or fraternity and sorority advisors when making adjustments for the upcoming academic year? What do you think would be a good practice for them to help make this pivot?
That's a great question. You want to immediately just say, do everything virtual and just be online and stay there and stay home is what I want to say, but they're coming. And so I think it is pushing them, if they haven't already, to think about, this is the time, if there is not, to really be thinking about what programs that you're wanting to do and to really organize your year. Because usually, I mean, this is not just happening within FSL, this is student organizations across the board at all institutions, where it's more, sometimes we might fly by the seat of our pants and of like, oh, I think this will be great, we should do this, oh, we'll do it this time. But I think in the season that we are in, it really is going to be about some proper planning and thinking about the programs that you're putting forward, and can these programs be done in a virtual space? And so, you know, if you're thinking, I really want to do a large scale program, is that working with TSG to request the funding of being able to utilize a bigger platform than Zoom, because Zoom only holds up to 500. So is it requesting some funds so you can go on a platform that's going to be bigger? So I really think it's going to have to be like, let's try to start with our planning, if it's not already been happening, of what are the things that we can be doing. And then if we are really pressed to try to do programs and events for students, where we are meeting, to really challenge yourself to think about, like, why is that? And if you really have to do so, then how are you going to do it where it is safe, and that you're going to be able to follow all of the guidelines, even right down to like food. Like, there is no buffet, it is boxed lunches in these pieces. And so are you thinking about like what those prices are going to be? So just trying to consider those pieces. And is there, like, are you utilizing like house party, I think, where they have different type of events that you can do within? So I think it's going to be a lot of encouraging them to plan and to really prepare for the year, versus I think sometimes what may happens is they may come in and then they might take the time to start thinking about it and be planning, versus I think they've got to come in knowing that this is going to be what they're wanting to do.
I think thinking outside of the box, you know, yes, you know, social distancing is not the same as social isolation. And we know that all of us don't want to be isolated, and especially students. There's a huge part of college of connecting with your fellow peers and hanging out with people. But how can you do that in a different way that keeps you safe? Because, you know, most of our young people think, you know, I'm in good health, I'm going to get it. Even if I get it, I'm not going to die from it, right? But the bigger picture, and asking them to think of the bigger picture, like you say, Krystal, their community, but not just their community, but the faculty, the staff, the people that are cleaning their facilities, the people that are working outside on the lawn, the many facets of a college campus that keeps it running. And how many of them will be affected because we know it spreads. You could be asymptomatic and be a carrier and not even know it. And then not only are you putting yourself at risk, but you're putting all the people I just said and your own family members. You know, you go to a party, a fraternity or sorority party, and then you go home and see your grandmother. Well, now you've just put your grandmother at a bigger risk because she's in a not protected, a higher at risk population. So it's kind of looking at and giving students the idea that the choice to comply with social distancing, not social isolation, but social distancing, is not about your individual rights, but it's your right as being part of a community. And they, you know, most of your fraternity and sorority is all about community and about doing it together and doing it the right way. So this is part of that, being responsible, being part of that community within each of their own chapters, but then in the bigger community of North Philadelphia, and then the bigger community of the families and other people in our state and your state, right?
Yeah, I know one of our advisors commented just bringing attention to Zoom having additional license options to expand how many participants can be in one meeting. I just wanted to bring attention to that because I think some of us aren't aware. Just the size and scope of some of our meetings are so much smaller than ever reaching the 500 or 1,000 mark. But I think from a programming lens, that's really helpful. Our allocations committee have not finalized how they're approaching requests this semester just yet. Our presentation to get that funding actually was today. So we'll see how much we were granted, considering how much has shifted in the last couple months and what we actually can feasibly pull off from a programming standpoint this semester. But I think I want to acknowledge that some of our organizations, certainly from a national lens, have provided additional resources or platforms for students to host their meetings and programs. And Temple FSL, Temple allocations, any other entity are also going to try to supplement that experience and help make as many modifications as possible. Given the circumstances. We did get a question in the Q&A box that asked what kind of ideas have already been shared with fraternity and sorority leaders regarding how to create that distance in group settings during the colder months. So we don't even know how we're getting back to campus. Truthfully, we have not put the forethought in to, how that shifts once it gets cold and the outdoors isn't an option. We're hoping to have kind of our back to school guidelines in the next week or so going out to student leaders and our chapter advisors. But I think similar to what Camile and Krystal said, we're going to have to get creative. Like this semester isn't going to look anything like it typically does. I think it's a really great opportunity to really hone in to what it means when we say sisterhood and brotherhood. Some of our chapters are upwards of 200 members, and we probably won't be able to bring together all 200 members, but how cool is it to have an opportunity to maybe engage some sisters or brothers who aren't typically in group together to do smaller sisterhood or brotherhood experiences? I think I talked to a student leader today and we were talking about some off-campus options as far as, whatever the city allows. My thought is that's going to be way safer guidelines wise than you probably even bringing folks over to your house. And so, Matt and I have also been thinking about how do we maximize funding in that regard? How do we get you that extra money to go and do something as a chapter? And we're happy to hear additional thoughts on or brainstorm with, like, we think we want to do this, but we can't afford it. How, like, what might be an option? So a lot of it is going to be case by case with chapters, depending on what they want to do, or what parts of the semester they're still looking to, or what parts of our typical experience they're looking to hold on to. But never forget, we're leaving campus November 20th. So we might miss some of the colder months that we typically spend together and wrapping up the semester in a traditional way.
I would also say we've also attempted to already adjust some of our larger scale programming. So we've already made the call about Panhellenic recruitment that will take place in a virtual setting. We've also made the call with MGC Meet the Greeks taking place in a virtual setting. IFC has been working to create their own recruitment plans to address what recruitment will look like for them, and knowing that their Meet the Greeks will for sure be in a virtual setting. And MPHC has also chosen to kind of flip Black Greek 101 and their Meet the Greeks to accommodate more of what is necessary for a virtual setting versus an in-person event. So these are definitely conversations that are happening on the council level, and we hope that as we challenge the councils, that the chapters are also being challenged in a similar type of way. We understand that there are certain types of events that just cannot happen virtually. We have seen some virtual ritual ceremonies, but we know some of your organizations refuse to allow some of that virtualness to happen. So as those things come up, we are happy to help address some of those things. And I've talked with some students already about some virtual or some in-person ritual ceremonies and how we can adjust to meet those needs. But it's also just an ongoing conversation and a kind of a move as we go kind of conversation, knowing some of our members still need to present their members and some of them still need to initiate them as well. So definitely hear all of that, and it is definitely a pivot that we are still in the process of making.
And our student activities team has been working all summer, pulling together a virtual toolkit that we're prepared to share with student organizations and chapters to really digest, like, how do I utilize technology in the virtual space to maximize this experience. We've also been the guinea pig for a lot of virtual programming. And as Krystal said, I think as allocations committee and other funding sources narrow in on their guidelines for this semester, potentially having access to trying on some of those things. We've seen some really great new member presentations in the virtual space over this summer. We've also seen chapters, even from a national lens, organizations coming together to do gaming tournaments and other things, because the key component is just the connectivity. Like, people want to connect and people want to have some level of engagement beyond mom, dad, whomever I live with, and the safety of my home. So we're definitely on board to continue creating opportunities like that, and are all ears to helping hearing what you all have discussed or want to try on and brainstorming with you.
So our next question kind of relates to that. So in the news recently, we've had a lot about some COVID parties that have been happening. So do you think that some of these stories are exaggerated? Or are we anticipating college-age students contributing to the mass spread of COVID from a social lens, in your opinion?
So I want to address that in a little bit with, I'm sure most of you have seen the story of the 30-year-old man who believed the coronavirus was a hoax and attended the COVID party. He died after being infected with the virus. This is in Texas. And the Dr. Jane Appleby of Methodist Hospital in San Antonio said he deliberately went to this party to see if it was a hoax. And right before he died, he turned to a nurse and said, "I think I made a mistake." To me, it's too late. That mistake, obviously, he's deceased, and there's no turning back from there. There's also been reports in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, of organizers throwing a COVID party at the university with students competing to see who could catch COVID first. And then they would, they would put money into a pot, and if you got it first, you'd win the money. Well, okay. The university set warnings and said, let's not do that. They can't confirm or deny that that's actually what's been happening, but it's out there. You know, the idea when they used to have chickenpox parties and they would get them and then you'd be immune to it and you'd go on your merry way, that is not proving true with COVID. So, especially because it is deadly. I mean, let's be real. You can die from this. You may be 20, you may be 18, and you may not die from it, but it is a serious illness. A doctor from the Lenox Hill Hospital in New York said, the bottom line is asking yourself this: how much do you value your life? The important question is, if you get a text, your answer should be not yes, not maybe, but unequivocally no. It's really the party represents your life. You're risking your life and the life of others. You know, those being on a ventilator, from what research has shown and stories we've heard and personal people that I know, it is very, very distressing to be on a respirator. And you have to decide, is the risk of dying worth the COVID party? And they're not fake. I mean, they're coming about and people are having them, and it's not a good idea.
So I think also going off of that, when we're looking at that location of the social event too, what other effects do you think, like basements or where traditional social events might happen, have effect on this event as well?
Well, the smaller the space, the longer you're in it, the more air that's being transferred from each other, the higher the risk you are. So, now we're outside, we're walking around in parks, and they still want you to be 6 feet apart. But think about going into a house, a fraternity or sorority house. How big is it? And how many people are there? And how much space do you have 6 feet apart from each other? I doubt it, but I don't know. I've never been to a fraternity house. I can't, or sorority temple. But you have to think of the more enclosed the space you are, the longer the time you're there, even with a mask. And this is going to be gross, but think about this. If you're drinking or smoking and somebody throws up at that party, all those bodily fluids are going in the air. It's like puffing up, people are getting sick. I know it's gross, but it is what's happening, and those particles are coming into your lungs. That's something to think about.
Yeah, and I think the university doesn't own or manage any of our fraternity sorority facilities. So we will issue guidelines. We've been having one-to-one conversations with chapters around, for the people who live in these official chapter facilities, how are we preparing for our return to that space? But I think this conversation is so relevant outside of those facilities too, right? Our members live somewhere. Many of them live together. Many of them do choose to host events outside of our social policy. And what does that mean in a COVID environment, right? Like now I'm not in the basement, I'm dispersed throughout this row home. And, what are the additional precautions or, again, things that I need to consider that go so far left of just the policy, but just like pure health and safety and boundaries, and how I can feel most comfortable in my living space.
I what I keep thinking about, my hope is that, I think every institution probably feels this way. My hope will be that our students will say, like, I'm not interested in creating something like that. But I'm prepared that they could do something like that. I think the thing for them to have to consider for as students is, the reality is coming from like student conduct and having some of the cases that have come into our office just behind some of their registered social events, and how easily things can get out of control with a registered social event, and how it can be, and some of it can be within things that they couldn't foresee to happen. And so if that is something in normal circumstances or these pre-COVID experiences that you were dealing with, where you had a register events, but still something went wrong or went left, and you ended up having to contact, to have EMS come out or something of that nature. If those things could still happen with every precautionary measures you have put into place, if that can still happen, just imagine what could have happened. And now we're in a pandemic. And so I think it's having to really have that reality of this is here. In the university, we don't own these spaces. And so we're going to be saying, please don't, please consider, you might want to do this. And I think even as advisors, you all will probably be encouraging them to think outside of the box and think in different ways of how to engage with their members and with those who like to associate with the organization and spend time with them. But at the end of the day, if it is something that puts into place, not from the sense of trying to be the scary office that's like, we're going to come and get you. But the reality is the university is still going to hold you accountable, and it won't just be at the place of like, is this a social violation or is this a violation of other published policy? The question at hand is going to be, is this also causing harm? Have you put people's lives as well as your own life in danger, and should you be held accountable at that level? And so that comes with a heavier weight of accountability versus just you violated a social policy. And so wanting to have them thinking about those things as well. And that's not the approach that we want to take with them. And even with just our students in general, our office is not trying to even approach it from that angle. We really want to have educational conversations. But at the end of the day, we do have a code to uphold, and we have a community to protect. And we will hold those accountable if they're not going to help us keep our community safe.
The other piece of that, we know that with the opiate epidemic that's out there and some overdoses that have been happening, we have had a very decline in Narcan reversals because people are afraid to be giving any kind of assistance. And how am I going to get impacted by that with COVID? The idea of if somebody needs mouth to mouth, do we even do that anymore? Do I get that close to you? I'm not even talking just with drugs and alcohol. I'm talking in general, having people around and being mindful of what you are as neighbors, friends, colleagues, willing to do for somebody in a time of need. And the fact that just this past weekend in Bricktown, New Jersey, a young girl had a party and 400 people showed up. And she told the police, I kept trying to tell them to leave, they wouldn't leave. So police from 4 different districts had to come in to help corral and disperse these 400 people that were not social distancing. So think about the ripple effect that had of 400 people being in one space that didn't social distance. Nobody knows if they have COVID or not, but they dispersed them, and how far out is that going to go in those communities? And she didn't even anticipate that. She had no intention of having 400 people at her party.
So we've talked a lot about alcohol, but can we also kind of pivot and talk a little bit more too about what other drugs or like smoking has effects with COVID too? As some of you may know, Temple is a smoke-free campus as of last year. So that initiative has taken place on Temple property. But we know that Juuls are still a popular option for our fraternity and sorority membership. So what is the take on COVID and some of these practices that we see within students themselves?
So when I started, I talked to you about the respiratory system being the one that COVID attacks the most, right? So when you smoke an e-cigarette, it's a device that heats the liquid into an aerosol that you inhale. So now you're inhaling something into your lungs. It has nicotine in it, flavorings in it. And more importantly, there are other harmful chemicals in e-cigarettes and Juuls. Flavorings, there's a chemical that is linked to serious lung disease. Every time you inhale from one of those, and I don't want to say Juul only, because Juul is like a Kleenex is a brand name of a tissue, right? Juul is a brand name of a mechanism to vape, okay? So we'll use Juul, but we're not singling out Juul. I just want to clarify that. But every time you inhale from one of the vaping mechanisms, you also inhale little pieces of nickel, tin, and lead into your lungs. Now, I don't know about any of you, but my lungs never have any purpose for nickel, tin, and lead in their lungs. So the lungs are automatically trying to expel a foreign object in their body. Okay. Now you've got the aerosol that, think about how hot something has to get to turn it into a vapor. So you're vaping into your lungs a hot substance that's putting nickel, tin, and lead in there. And COVID-19 affects your respiratory system. So if you get the virus, you've got two things that's happening already with smoking and e-cigarettes, weed included. When you smoke weed included, it gets in your lungs and it's diminishing your capacity. And when people have trouble breathing, it is awful to listen to them and try to catch that breath. So it's really critical that you understand that when you're doing this, you're putting yourself in a notch up with COVID. You're putting yourself, if you get that, even at the age of college students, and you're vaping or smoking weed or smoking cigarettes, using e-cigarettes, you're making your lungs work really hard to combat COVID. They're working hard as it is to get rid of the stuff that you're putting in it. But now you're asking your body to really triple the effort to get rid of a virus that we know is deadly. So it's a major risk. And I think students need to understand, people in general need to understand that e-cigarettes were meant to help you quit smoking. Yes, it does. It does help with the tar in your lungs, but the amount of nicotine that you get when you use an e-cigarette or a Juul is like smoking a pack of 20 cigarettes, a pack of cigarettes. So we're finding that people who've never smoked before are now hooked on nicotine, and eventually don't get enough with the e-cigarettes and the Juuls. So now they're doing that and smoking cigarettes at the same time. So now you're asking your lungs to do quadruple the work. It's a choice. It's something that you have to think about and decide, am I ready to do? That's what I'm gonna do. Okay. And we have no idea what the secondhand vaping aerosol does secondhand to people. It's just too new. We just don't know.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think whenever new trends or things come out, there's obviously ample studies that need to be done, and there just hasn't been enough time for that, to be looked at and know such negative effects that are happening. So that is very concerning in our conversation of what does this look like for our students overall too, and how we can continue to challenge the use and their continued livelihood as we look into that. So we have some questions in our chat from Q&A portions. So one of the questions is, will updated policies and procedures be available to advisors? So the short answer is yes. The long answer is, because they are always changing, we would continue to change and update those. So we will stay in communication as much as possible with some of those changes. One of the conversations, not COVID related, but kind of COVID related, is with Diamond accreditation. A large number of you have already taken part in our Diamond accreditation review and know that we are in the process of updating that to a new and more user-friendly process for chapters. But one of the things that we took into account and are taking into account is chapters don't all operate the same within the same council. And we know that and understand that, but we also know that they're not going to operate the same this year. So one of the things that we have really taken into account is more likely than not, your diamond accreditation will not go down this year. We want to make sure that we are being flexible in those kinds of ways. If you have some conduct issues, that could cause your score to go down. But for the most part, your score will not go down. But you will be able to see an increase in your score over this year as well. We don't want to put a hard pause on it. We want to allow for those improvements, but we also don't want to stress chapters out to have to put in added work and not really relish in what they got for their score this year. So that's just one policy and procedure that we are kind of adjusting and have made some groundwork on, but we're still in the process of getting all of those out, knowing that we are not necessarily the decision makers in some of these changes and need to be made aware of what is and is not allowed for us to change to. But we will definitely make sure that those are available. I don't like to really sit on anything once we get it, so we will send that out to our advisors as soon as we can and have the green light to go on those.
Yeah, and I think it's just bringing attention back to what Matt was saying about being flexible. So we've had a task force working on our reopening procedures since we left campus in March. And I think every day we get a new update or a new ounce of information that, you know, changes the game a little bit and it forces us to consider things that we hadn't already. I asked one clarifying question and watched my director add it to the guidelines. Like that's where we are as far as trying to cover all of our bases and be in compliance with the city and the state. So as soon as we have something that's concrete, we will roll it out, but knowing that, you know, within the week we might be rolling out a revised version, and the expectation is that you in your chapter follow such based on where we are, not based on when we first started talking about, let's say, your event or something in particular that the chapter was doing. So we're going to roll with the punches. We're in this together. But I think that adaptability and that flexibility among our advising team as well as our student leadership team is going to be critical this semester.
The next question that we have is an understanding of maybe a myth or if this is true. Can you contract COVID from any other body opening other than mouth and nose?
I don't have an answer. I think that's something the CDC or the WHO will come out with and let us know. But I also think that, you know, precautionary measures in all hospitals, they're saying, you know, I've read something just recently that said they're really amping up, even in a sterile operating room, that bodily fluids, there have been a case or two where they've gotten COVID from a procedure. So they're amping up all of their sterilizing and all of that. So I don't really have an answer. I don't know for sure, but I would think you would want to protect yourself no matter what, like, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also brings up some conversation of understanding what college hookup culture looks like, right? So like, how do we have those conversations with our chapters that might not be the easiest or most comfortable to have? But how do we, you know, have some conversations around like, you need to be safe in more than just one way of being safe with some of the relationships that we're having and understanding what that looks like in the sense of general health and safety of people as well.
That's where I was going with that too, Matt. Like that's what I first thought about. We had a speaker last year who we brought in to talk about sexual violence, and he was like, you know what? We talk about sexual assault all the time, but we don't talk about sex. And we don't educate our students about sex. And there's an element of consent that comes along with sex by itself, not just in the realms of did I or did I not sexually violate someone or make them uncomfortable. And I think that there's an ounce of that in that question, right? That like, what are all the ways that I can engage that have nothing to do with the guidelines? How do I get around these guidelines? I do know and have read that, sex is among the precautions that they, like maybe I should only have sex with who I'm typically having sex with. Like, we don't get to tell the students that, but that's something that they 100% should consider. I think that, COVID-19 has caused for consent and boundaries to enter a lot more spaces than just when we're talking about sexual violence. So advisors, if you get in a space where that comes up, I would definitely take the urge to, or lean into the urge to push a little bit, because there's definitely something that our students may or may not be thinking about, but definitely could have a ripple effect on their chapter and others in the Temple community.
But think about the fact that we're asking people to remain 6 feet apart. If you're hooking up, you're certainly not 6 feet apart. So, in general, we're asking people for your own health and safety to be 6 feet apart. So think about just how big that goes over into just having sex with somebody. You're not 6 feet apart, and you don't know where that other person's been or who they've been with. We know that in general in having sex and sexually transmitted diseases and things like that, but this on top of it is, I keep saying this, and I mean it. It's life and death. I mean, you're putting your life at risk when you're doing things more than we've ever thought before, and we have to think about that as a community, as students, as uncomfortable conversations come up, because they're not easy conversations we're asking people to have. Talking about drugs, alcohol, sex, violence, marijuana, e-cigarettes, all of these are not easy conversations, but they're conversations that, for the health and safety of the students, the faculty, the staff, the community, need to be addressed in a timely manner and upfront. And those lines of communication for students to give you feedback and to give their advisors feedback, and both ways. This is going to be hard on students. This is very different. This is nothing like they ever thought it was going to be, or any of us thought it was going to be, but it's very hard for them. And to give them a space. I think one of the critical things is to give students a space to come back and tell you how it's making them feel, what their thoughts are, what they like and what they don't like. What, I can live with this, I can't go there, right? And just to say you have to is only going to cause barriers, and we want to put down as many barriers as we can.
And I would just even add into that, and just thinking about, like, even with a hookup culture and everything that we were chatting about, something that was just coming to mind was, even in those conversations, to be coming from a place where it doesn't have the student feeling like they're being shamed, right. Because that could potentially cause even more harm or danger, but more so of just wanting them to take ownership. Like, this is your body, and you have ownership over your body and what's happening with you, whether you decide to do so or to not. But if you decide to do so, to have to consider some of the consequences at this moment of what that could occur. It's not to say that these things weren't there beforehand, but it is escalated at a different place now. And so wanting, and I always say this even with like my staff, and when we're talking with students who come in through our office, so we also have to meet our students and even with ourselves in this moment with some grace, and what that is going to be looking like. And our hope is that our students are going to get this right, but they may not, we may not. But how do we make sure we're having grace in this, and how do we make sure that we don't shame? So if a student does say, I did sleep with this person or such and such, that we have a healthy conversation with them, but that helps them still feel empowered, that they had that right to do so, but not feeling shamed in that sense as well. So I think it's going to be, I always say I think 2020 is done for per se in terms of like what is happening, but I do think it is still going to be a continuous year, and even after a vaccine comes into place, I think there's still going to be, we've got another year, maybe year and a half of working through this and dealing with the ebbs and flow of that. And so it's having to have some grace with ourselves and with our students and how we interact and have the conversations around it. But like everyone has said, the conversations will be hard, but they are still very necessary.
For sure. So our final question, just also to be cognizant of time. So with COVID, if you are actively spreading to innocent people, do you think that this could be any legal issues or even like conduct issues on the university end, in your opinion, on this? Obviously, no one is a lawyer on this, but more so what your opinion is based off of what you've seen.
Can you repeat the question? I was reading Liz's comment and I was like, ooh, and then I heard some pieces. I'm really sorry.
Yeah. So if you have COVID and are actively spreading it to innocent people, could that be a criminal or a conduct issue on the campus if they are intentionally doing so?
Okay, that is a great question. I am not a lawyer, so I just want to lead with that. But I think for us in student conduct, if we go based on the preponderance of evidence, so more likely than not. So if we have more likely than not of evidence that a student is doing something to that nature, I 100% feel like we would hold that student accountable. Whether that's within FSL or any space, we would hold the student accountable and be trying to figure out, like, you know, what is leading that behavior behind that. Like, that's not just I'm doing this but what's the behavior behind that? So we'll be trying to address that as well. And so, like I said, in terms of how we look at causing harm and threats and assault, and is that also disorderly conduct? Like, once we start talking about like those potential code violations, the weight of the accountability is heavier. And so that could be, if this is, we have the evidence and the witnesses and all the pieces as we're working together on a case that shows that this was very intentional and that we were doing this. I mean, that could potentially be a suspension, that could potentially be an expulsion. It just would be more so like the egregiousness of the act. So I definitely think that it would be approach of student conduct of that we are going to be holding you accountable in that space. I don't know what it looks like from a legal lens, but within student conduct, we would hold that student accountable.
Well, and I think at some point, somewhere is going to go back to the whole HIV and AIDS and some history of how people were held accountable if you intentionally were spreading some sort of, you know, that disease was different than unintentionally doing that. But if you knew full well you were, there is some legal precedent that has been set in that realm as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point it gets to what happened in that as well. So just a thought. I have no idea, but just a thought process.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you both for participating. I know this has been really informative for us as well. I hope our advisors got just as much out of this experience. I will turn it over to Nikia to give some closing remarks.
Yeah, just emphasizing our gratitude for Camile and Krystal hopping on. This is our first time doing anything like this to engage our advisors, and we're super excited to have you all kick us off. and hope the next 3 weeks are equally as engaging and informative. As it relates to this topic, I just wanted to emphasize to our advisors, you know, this webinar was titled Living in a COVID Environment, and we talked a lot about how do we help the students do this, but never forget, we all are living in a COVID environment. That includes our advisors. And so, I used the word boundaries a couple times as we were talking. I think it's so important for you all as advisors to also create the boundaries that you need to feel you're most comfortable, to feel you're safest, to take care of the people in your life that you're responsible for. And that could mean a chapter choosing to do something, bringing their exec team that's seemingly small together, and you feel uncomfortable being there, right? Like that might just need to be a Zoom meeting, opposed to inviting members into your home, or however we typically do executive meetings. And I think that there's a host of things that our chapters probably will want to do that need advisor support that might not happen purely because advisor does not have the capacities to support in the way that we typically do. I think that all of us are here to support the students and to help them actualize what they want this experience to look like. All of us have had a fraternity sorority experience from an undergraduate level. Hope it was wonderful. But I think, now is really a time for us to exercise really asking for what we need and really trying to still be the best advisors while taking care of yourself too. I think that the next 3 sessions will have a common theme as far as how we're creating this culture of care, how we're really but how advisors are included in that. Like, you are a strong part of our community, and when we talk about protecting the nest, that includes you, and that self-advocacy includes you. So can't thank you enough for hopping on. If there are additional questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to Matt or myself, but we will see you next week. Matt, you want to give reminders about the rest of the series?
Yep. So next week, we will be talking about social justice. We have 2 panelists again. That will be Chelsea Dobb and Joseph Thompson to have a conversation around social justice and how we facilitate some of that discussion, but also take some reflective notions on what our own identities play in the areas of social justice. So we are excited for that one as well. We will also be sending out a survey to all that participated following all 4 of our conversations, so that way you can give some feedback and how we can make improvements doing this. Is the first time that we've been doing this. So like I said, we just are so thankful for all of you for jumping on with us, and especially thankful for our panelists for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having us.
Enjoy
fun. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.